Desmond was halfway through lifting his coffee when three identical little girls stopped directly in front of him, stared at the faded compass tattoo on his forearm, and one quietly whispered, "Hello, sir. Our mother has a mark exactly like yours." Before he could even ask what she meant, a terrified woman came sprinting across the playground, froze the instant their eyes met, and in that single heartbeat, Desmond realized the one secret he'd buried 8 years ago had somehow found him. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. The bench had a groove worn into the third slat, right where Desmond always sat. He knew it because he'd been coming to this park every Saturday for 3 years, since Ezra was old enough to climb the ladder without help. Coffee in his left hand, jacket collar up against the October wind, he watched his son argue with a pigeon over half a pretzel like it was the most important negotiation in the world. "You gotta share," Ezra told the bird, dead serious. The pigeon did not agree. Desmond laughed under his breath and took a sip of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. This was the part of the week he lived for. Not the garage, not the invoices piling up on his desk, not the transmission he still hadn't finished on the '67 Mustang sitting up on blocks. Just this, a Saturday, his boy, 20 minutes of nothing mattering. He didn't notice the three girls at first. They came from the direction of the jungle gym, moving the way kids don't usually move. Not running, not chasing each other, just walking. 3 sets of small brown Mary Janes crossing the mulch in a straight line like they'd already decided where they were headed. Matching forest green dresses, matching burgundy bows, matching faces, all 3 of them, down to the same gap between their front teeth. Desmond noticed them the way anyone notices triplets, a small double take, a half smile, 3 of them, and went back to his coffee. They didn't go back to the swings. They stopped directly in front of his bench, close enough that he had to look up from his cup. 3 pairs of eyes, all fixed on the same spot. Not his face, his arm. The compass tattoo sat on his left forearm, half hidden under his rolled sleeve. A design he'd carried for 8 years and never bothered finishing. No needlework in the center, no color, just the outer ring and the 4 points, faded at the edges now, more shadow than ink. One of the girls, the one in the middle, tilted her head like she was checking something against a memory. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice was careful, rehearsed almost, like she'd practiced the sentence on the walk over. "Our mother has a mark just like that one, on her arm, the same shape." Desmond's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "What?" The word came out smaller than he meant it to. "The circle," the girl on the left said, pointing without touching, with the lines coming out of it. "She has it right here." She tapped her own forearm in the exact spot his tattoo sat. He should have said something. A dad-sized brush-off. "That's a cool coincidence, sweetheart." Anything. Instead, his mouth had gone dry, and his mind had gone somewhere it hadn't been in a long time. A hotel room 2 states away. A borrowed tattoo gun. A woman laughing at how badly he flinched. "It's not finished," the third girl said quietly, and that was the sentence that took the air out of him. Not because it was strange, because it was true, and there was no way at all. A 7-year-old stranger should know that. "Ezra," Desmond called out, not looking away from the girls. "Give me a second, bud." Ezra glanced over, shrugged, and went back to pretzel diplomacy. "How do you—" Desmond started, and then stopped, because across the park, a woman had broken into a dead run. She came from the direction of the parking lot, camel coat flying open behind her, one hand pressed to her chest like she was trying to keep something from spilling out of it. Heels on gravel, which had to hurt, which she clearly didn't care about. She was shouting names. 3 names. 3 different names. One for each girl, but the same panic wrapped around all of them. The girls turned at the sound of her voice. Only then did their calm crack a little, like they knew they weren't supposed to be over here. weren't supposed to be pointing at strangers' arms and asking about matching marks. The woman reached them and dropped to her knees on the mulch, gathering all three into her arms in one motion, the kind of grab a parent only does when they've imagined the worst for the length of one terrifying sprint. "We're sorry, Mama," the middle one said. "We just wanted to ask him." "Ask him what?" The woman's head came up. Her eyes found Desmond's face and froze there. Whatever she'd been about to say died somewhere behind her teeth. Her hand, still resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder, went still. Desmond watched something move across her expression. Recognition, then disbelief, then a kind of fear that had nothing to do with three little girls wandering off from a playground. Neither of them said a word. The silence stretched long enough that even the girls went quiet, sensing something adult and unreadable happening over their heads. Finally, the woman stood, pulling her daughters gently against her legs like a shield, and gave Desmond a small, tight nod. Not a greeting, something closer to an apology that hadn't found its words yet. Then she turned and walked them quickly back toward the lot, one girl looking over her shoulder the whole way, still watching his arm like it held the answer to a question she hadn't finished asking. Desmond sat there long after they'd disappeared into a silver SUV and pulled away. He looked down at his own forearm, traced the faded outline with his thumb, the way he hadn't in years. There was only one person alive who knew that compass had never been finished. And he hadn't seen her in 8 years. If stories about hidden family secrets, unexpected reunions, and the unbreakable bond between a parent and child mean something to you, subscribe and join us for more heartfelt stories like this. Sleep didn't come that night. Desmond lay on top of the covers with his arm bent above his head, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles in the dark, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same three faces staring at his forearm like it was a page out of a book they'd already read. Around midnight, he gave up pretending. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, and rolled his sleeve up under the lamplight. The compass looked the same as it always did, unfinished. A ring, 4 points, no center. 8 years of fading, and it still hadn't gone soft enough to stop meaning something. He hadn't let himself think about that weekend in a long time. Not on purpose, just a door he'd quietly stopped opening, the way you stop checking on a room you've closed off in a house. But tonight the door wasn't just open, it had been kicked in by 3 7-year-olds in matching bows. 8 years ago, Desmond was 24 and still figuring out whether restoration work could actually be a life or just a hobby that paid badly. A regional classic car meet 3 states over. The kind of event where guys twice his age brought 60-year-old engines back from the dead and argued about torque specs until 2 a.m. He'd gone for the exposure. He'd left with something he never told anyone about. Her name was Odessa, though at the time she'd introduced herself as something else, a name he'd believed for 2 full days before she finally told him the truth on the drive to the airport, almost as an afterthought, like it barely mattered anymore because neither of them expected to see each other again. She'd been standing near the show floor entrance, arms crossed, watching a room full of men talk over each other about a car nobody in the room actually owned, and she'd caught his eye like she found the whole spectacle funnier than she was letting on. They talked for 6 hours that first night. Not about cars, about the things neither of them said out loud to anyone else. The pressure of being expected to become somebody, the exhaustion of always performing competence, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling like a stranger in your own life. She never mentioned family money. He never asked why a woman dressed like she did was standing alone at a car show in the middle of nowhere. Some things you don't ask when someone finally starts talking honestly for the first time, in what sounds like years. On the second night, half a bottle of wine in, she'd said something he still remembered word for word. "I feel like I don't have a direction, like somebody handed me a life and forgot to include a compass." He'd laughed, but she hadn't been joking, and somewhere in that conversation the idea took hold. Matching tattoos, something neither of them would explain to anyone. A private joke about 2 people who felt lost, pretending to point themselves somewhere. They'd found a shop 3 blocks from the hotel that was still open past midnight. He remembered the buzz of the needle, her hand gripping his other arm so hard it left marks, the 2 of them laughing through the pain, because neither wanted to admit how much it hurt. Neither finished the design. The artist ran out of time before his shift ended, and by the next morning neither of them brought up going back. It felt right unfinished, somehow. A compass with no set direction yet, same as both of them. 2 days, 2 names, only one of them true. No numbers exchanged, no promises made. She'd told him plainly, almost gently, that this was a weekend and nothing more, and he'd respected that because it hadn't felt like rejection. It had felt like relief. 2 people giving each other permission to be nobody in particular for 48 hours. He never saw her again after that airport drive. Now, sitting in the dark with his laptop open on his knees, Desmond typed her real name into a search bar for the first time in 8 years and felt his stomach tighten before the page even finished loading. Nothing matched at first. No social profiles under that name, no obvious trace. He tried variations, tried pairing it with the city where they'd met, tried the name of the hotel. 20 minutes in, he found a small announcement buried in an old business journal, a name close enough to hers, attached to a photo 3 years old, standing in front of a building he didn't recognize, dressed in a blazer instead of the worn denim jacket she'd had on the night they met. The face in the photo was older, more composed, styled for a camera instead of a car show floor. But it was her. He was certain of it before he even finished reading the caption. He kept scrolling, kept clicking. The trail thinned out fast, no further mentions, no other photos, nothing that connected easily to the woman he remembered laughing too hard over cheap wine in a hotel room. Whoever she'd become it quietly, deliberately, like someone who didn't want to be found by search engines or by anyone else. It was past 3 a.m. when he almost gave up. Then, buried 3 pages deep in results, a single image loaded, a candid shot from some charity gala, cropped tight on a small group of executives shaking hands. She stood at the edge of the frame, sleeve pushed up slightly from adjusting her watch. On her shoulder, just visible at the edge of the fabric, sat the outline of a circle. 4 points, no center. Desmond stared at the screen until the image blurred from how long he'd gone without blinking. It wasn't finished either. By Sunday afternoon, Desmond had a name, a company, and a headache from squinting at his phone screen for 6 straight hours. Odessa Vance. That was the name attached to the photo, the one that kept surfacing once he knew what to search for. Chief architect and founder of a firm called Meridian Collective. Urban redevelopment, affordable housing projects. The kind of work that got written up in trade magazines with words like visionary and quietly influential attached to it. No interviews longer than a paragraph. No personal website beyond a bio page with a single professional headshot. Every article treated her like someone who'd agreed to have her work discussed, but never herself. Ezra had gone down for his nap an hour ago, and Desmond was sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop open, a legal pad next to it filling up with half-formed notes he didn't fully understand yet. He wasn't a detective. He restored engines, not investigations. But something in him wouldn't let this sit. Not after Saturday, not after the compass on her shoulder in that gala photo. He found an old interview, 3 years back, one of the only ones where she'd said more than a few careful sentences. A local business paper, the kind nobody outside the industry read. The reporter had asked about her background, and she'd answered in a way that Desmond now recognized, having lived through it himself for 2 days once. Smooth, warm, and completely evasive. She mentioned growing up around the East Coast. She mentioned family expectations without naming a single family member. She mentioned nothing about school, nothing about where she'd lived before the company existed, nothing that would let a stranger draw a line from point A to point B. It read like someone who had spent a long time making sure there was no trail to follow. He thought back to that hotel room, her voice low in the dark. I feel like somebody handed me a life and forgot to include a compass. He hadn't understood it then, except as something sad and poetic that 2 half-drunk strangers say to each other. Now it read differently, like a woman describing an inheritance she hadn't chosen. A name, a career, a family legacy laid over her like a coat that didn't fit. And somewhere in the middle of that, a stranger at a car show who didn't know or care what her last name was supposed to mean. He almost closed the laptop, told himself this was enough. He'd confirmed she was alive, successful, clearly fine, clearly moved on into a life that had nothing to do with him. That should have been the end of it. A strange Saturday afternoon, a coincidence explained by nothing more than an unfinished tattoo that maybe wasn't as rare a decision as he'd assumed. Then he found the gala photo's original source, a charity magazine spread from 8 months earlier, a piece about local philanthropists and their families. Odessa Vance was mentioned in one caption, standing at a fundraising dinner, and beneath the photo, in small print easy to miss if he hadn't been reading every word twice, Vance, mother of 7-year-old triplets, has quietly become one of the region's most influential voices in equitable urban design. Desmond read it 4 times. 7 years old. He set the phone down on the table like it had gotten too heavy to hold, and sat very still, doing math he didn't want to be doing. 8 years since the car show. 7 years since triplets who currently existed, and currently had a mother who currently had an unfinished compass tattoo on her shoulder. 9 months. That was all it took. And the timeline wasn't just close. It fit exactly. He got up from the table and walked to the sink, ran the water cold and splashed it on his face like that would undo the last 30 seconds. Down the hall, he could hear Ezra shifting in his sleep. Small sounds through the cracked door, completely unaware that his father was standing in the kitchen trying to keep his hands from shaking. 3 girls, identical, old enough to walk up to a stranger and calmly describe a tattoo they had no business recognizing. Old enough to notice their mother's shoulder. Old enough to ask questions about a mark she probably never fully explained. He thought about the middle one's voice at the park, careful, rehearsed, like she'd practiced the sentence on the walk over. Like this hadn't been a spontaneous approach, like she'd been waiting for the right moment to finally ask the question she'd been sitting with for years. "It's not finished," the third girl had said. Quiet, certain. How would a 7-year-old know that unless she'd asked her mother the same question 100 times and never gotten a real answer? Just enough of one to know the shape was incomplete. Just enough silence to make a child curious enough to test the theory on a stranger in a park. Desmond gripped the edge of the counter and made himself breathe slower. He didn't have proof. Not really. A tattoo wasn't a paternity test. A caption in a magazine wasn't a confession. There were 1,000 explanations that didn't involve him at all. Coincidences, other artists, other stories he knew nothing about. He told himself this 3 times, 4 times, and none of it made the feeling in his chest go away. Because underneath all the reasonable explanations was one unreasonable, impossible, undeniable fact. 8 years ago, in a hotel room 2 states away, he had promised a woman with a stolen name that neither of them would ever regret one strange, unforgettable weekend. Now there were 3 little girls, old enough to walk, old enough to talk, old enough to notice everything, and every single number lined up exactly the way it shouldn't. He picked his phone back up, thumb hovering over the search bar, throat tight around words he could barely make himself think. Please don't let the math be right. Meridian Collective occupied the top 4 floors of a glass building downtown, the kind of address that made Desmond feel underdressed just walking through the revolving door in his canvas jacket. He'd changed twice before leaving the house that morning, settled on the same jacket anyway, because pretending to be someone he wasn't felt worse than showing up as himself. The security desk stopped him before he made it past the lobby planters. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No," Desmond admitted, "but I need her to see this." He tore a page from the legal pad he'd brought, the same one still covered in half-finished math from 2 nights of not sleeping, and wrote 4 words on a clean corner. He folded it once and held it out. "The compass found me." The guard looked at him like he dealt with strange men and stranger notes more often than his job description suggested, but something in Desmond's face, steady, unshaking, not the look of someone trying to hustle his way into a meeting, made him pick up the phone instead of the panic button. Desmond waited 11 minutes. He counted them. When the elevator doors opened again, a different woman waved him through, and this time nobody asked for an appointment. Odessa's office took up a corner of the 14th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, a wall of framed renderings for buildings that didn't exist yet. She was standing when he walked in, arms crossed the same way they'd been crossed at that car show 8 years ago, like it was a posture she went to when she needed a wall between herself and whatever was coming. She didn't say hello. "You shouldn't have come here." "I know," Desmond said. "I came anyway." Neither of them moved for a long moment. She looked older than the gala photo, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, and something about seeing her fully, not through a search result, not through a magazine caption, but standing 8 feet away in an office she'd clearly built with her own hands, made the whole thing suddenly, brutally real. Odessa, her real name, out loud, for the first time in 8 years. She flinched at it slightly, like she hadn't expected him to remember, or hadn't expected it to still carry weight.
"I need to ask you something, and I need you to just answer it. No speech, no softening it."
She didn't sit down. She didn't ask him to either. "Are they mine?" The question hung in the room between them, past the glass, past the framed buildings, past 8 years of a name she'd buried, and a life she'd built on top of it. She closed her eyes. Yes. One word. No qualifiers, no context, nothing to make it smaller than it was. Desmond felt his knees go slightly loose and put a hand against the back of a chair he hadn't been invited to sit in. "I found out about 6 weeks after you flew home," she said, voice steady in the way people get steady right before they fall apart. "I told myself I'd call. Then I told myself I'd wait until I was sure. Then I was sure, and I still didn't call, because by then I'd convinced myself it would be crueler to drag you into something you never signed up for." "You didn't ask me," Desmond said. "Not an accusation, just a fact, laid flat on the table between them. You decided for both of us." "I decided for all 4 of us," she said, and for the first time her voice cracked. "You had no idea who my family was. What it would have meant to be pulled into that world with 3 kids and no warning. I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself I was protecting them. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting people and just being afraid." Desmond didn't say anything for a while. He looked out the window instead, at a skyline he didn't recognize, in a life he'd had no part in building, that apparently included 3 small, specific, entirely real parts of him. 8 birthdays, he said quietly. 3 kids. I don't have a single memory of any of it. I know. They walked up to me in a park because they noticed a tattoo, he said. Not because anyone told them who I was, because they noticed a detail their own mother never explained to them. Odessa pressed her fingers against her eyes, briefly, and when she dropped her hand, her composure had come back, brittle but present, the practiced calm of someone who'd spent years learning to hold a room, even when everything in her wanted to fall apart in it. "They ask about it constantly," she admitted. "The tattoo, I never told them the truth. I told them it was just something from before they were born. I didn't know how to explain the rest without explaining you. And I didn't know how to explain you without admitting what I'd done." "What's done is done," Desmond said, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. "I'm not here to relitigate 6 weeks of a decision you made 8 years ago without me. I'm here because 3 girls looked at my arm like they'd been waiting years to ask about it, and I can't walk back out of this building pretending I don't know what that means now." Odessa nodded slowly, like she'd expected this and dreaded it equally. "What do you want, Desmond?" He didn't have an answer ready. He'd spent 2 days preparing for the confirmation, not for what came after it. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know I'm not walking away without one." She looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and then turned toward the window, giving him her back the way she'd once turned away from an entire room full of strangers at a car show, years before any of this had a name. Desmond left the building 20 minutes later without another word between them. He didn't feel angry walking to his car. He felt something heavier, something with no name he could locate, the particular grief of finding out you have 3 daughters and 8 years of birthdays you'll never get back. Desmond didn't remember the drive home. 1 minute he was pulling out of the parking garage beneath Meridian Collective, and the next he was sitting in his own driveway with the engine off, hands still on the wheel, no memory of the streets in between. It scared him a little how a person's body could keep functioning while the rest of them stayed frozen 14 floors up in a glass office. Inside, Ezra was building something out of couch cushions and refused to explain what it was supposed to be. "It's a fort, Dad." Obviously, 6 years old and already unimpressed with adult slowness. "Obviously," Desmond agreed, and helped him wedge the last cushion into place, grateful for something with simple rules. "Cushions here, blanket there. Don't let the structural integrity collapse." He wished the rest of his life worked that way. That night, after Ezra was asleep, Desmond sat on the edge of his son's bed longer than usual, watching him breathe in that heavy, unbothered way only children manage. He thought about 3 other children he'd never watched sleep. 3 birthdays a year, times 8 years, minus the 2 months before Odessa even knew. 22 birthdays he hadn't known were happening. 22 cakes he hadn't blown out candles for. First steps, first words, first days of school, all of it already finished, already filed away as memories that belonged to someone else's story. He wasn't angry at Ezra for existing, or at the life he'd built around him. That wasn't the shape of what he was feeling. It was closer to standing outside a house where a party had already happened, hearing about the laughter after the fact, walking through rooms still smelling like cake, and understanding you'd been invited to nothing, not out of malice, but because someone else had decided the invitation would hurt you. He blamed himself for about an hour, running through it the way people always do. If I'd asked more questions, if I'd gotten her number, if I'd pushed instead of respecting her silence, until somewhere in the exhaustion, he realized none of it held up. He hadn't walked away from anything. He'd never been given the chance to walk toward it. That distinction mattered. He wasn't sure yet what to do with it, but it mattered. Across town, in a house with rooms bigger than Desmond's entire apartment, Odessa sat at the edge of her daughter's shared bedroom doorway, unnoticed, listening to them argue about hair ties in the dark instead of sleeping. "He had sad eyes," one of them said. Odessa recognized the voice. Simone, always the bluntest of the 3, the one who said things the other 2 were thinking, but hadn't worked up to yet. "Everybody has sad eyes sometimes," her sister answered. Camille, the peacemaker, always trying to smooth the conversation down to something softer than it wanted to be. "Not like that," Simone said. "He looked like Mama does when she thinks we're asleep." The third voice, Naomi, was quieter. Was he crying? At the park, after we left. Nobody answered that one right away. Odessa stood frozen in the hallway, one hand against the wall, unseen and unable to make herself move. She should have walked in, should have redirected the conversation the way she'd redirected every question about that tattoo for 7 straight years. "It's just something from before you were born. Go to sleep, we'll talk about it tomorrow." Except tomorrow never came. Not honestly, not once. "Mama won't tell us anything," Simone said, and there was no anger in it, only the flat disappointment of a child who'd stopped expecting a different answer. "She just gets quiet." "Maybe it's not her secret to tell," Camille offered. "Then whose is it?" Silence answered that question, the kind of silence that told Odessa her daughters had been having versions of this conversation for longer than she'd realized, piecing together a mystery out of a mark on her shoulder and a stranger's face at a park, while she'd told herself she still had time to figure out what to say. She went to bed that night without walking into their room, hating herself for it, unable to find a version of honesty that didn't require unraveling every explanation she'd built for the past 8 years in one conversation she wasn't ready to have. The knock on Desmond's garage door came just after 9 the next morning, while he had his head under the hood of the Mustang he still hadn't finished, grease up to his elbows, radio playing low enough not to drown out his own thoughts. He almost didn't hear it over the engine noise. The second knock was harder. He wiped his hands on a rag hanging from his back pocket and walked to the door, expecting a customer, a delivery, anything ordinary. Odessa stood on the other side of it, alone. No trench coat this time, no corporate armor, just jeans and a plain sweater, hair pulled back, looking less like the woman from the 14th floor office and more like the one who'd sat across from him in a hotel room 8 years ago, admitting she didn't know which direction her life was supposed to point. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, before he could ask. Desmond stood there for a moment, grease-streaked and stunned, looking at the last person he'd expected to find outside his garage on an ordinary Tuesday morning. "You'd better come in," he said finally, and stepped aside to let her through. The garage smelled like motor oil and old coffee, and Odessa stood just inside the doorway like she wasn't sure the space would hold her weight. Desmond gestured toward a stool near the workbench, the only clean seat in the place, and she took it, hands folded in her lap, looking smaller than she had behind her desk 14 floors up. "I'm not here to apologize again," she said. "I did that already, and it wasn't enough, and I know saying it twice won't fix that either." "Then why are you here?" She was quiet for a moment, watching him lean against the workbench with his arms crossed, grease still under his fingernails from the engine he'd abandoned mid-repair. "I heard them last night," she said, through the door. "They think I don't know they've been piecing this together for years. Simone asked if you'd been crying after we left the park." Her voice caught slightly on that detail. I didn't answer her. I couldn't. Desmond didn't say anything. He let her keep going. "I've spent 7 years telling myself I was protecting them from complication, from a life divided between two very different worlds. I convinced myself that was love." She looked down at her hands. "I'm not as sure of that anymore." "So what are you offering?" Desmond said, sitting on my stool in my garage on a Tuesday morning. She reached into the bag at her side and set a folder on the workbench between them. Desmond didn't open it right away. "A settlement," she said. "Enough that you'd never have to worry about the shop, about bills, about anything, for the rest of your life. In exchange, no legal claim, no complications, no disruption to their lives. You'd walk away knowing you did right by them financially, and they'd never have to navigate a custody arrangement, blended families, any of it. It's clean, it's generous, and it's the least painful path for everyone, including you." Desmond looked at the folder for a long moment before he looked back at her. "You think I want your money?" "I think," Odessa said carefully, "that money solves problems. It solved a lot of mine. I'm not naive enough to pretend it doesn't matter that you've been struggling to keep this place running. I looked into it before I came here. I know what your last 2 years have looked like." Something in Desmond's jaw tightened. "You investigated me. I needed to know who was standing in my daughter's lives before I decided anything," she said, unapologetic. "Wouldn't you have done the same?" He didn't answer that, because she was right, and he hated that she was right. He picked up the folder finally, opened it, scanned the number on the first page. It was more money than he'd seen in one place in his entire life. Enough to pay off the shop's remaining debt twice over. Enough to fix the roof that had been leaking since spring. Enough that Ezra could go to whatever school Desmond wanted, wear whatever he wanted, never once feel the particular exhaustion of watching his father do math at the kitchen table every month. He thought about all of it, let himself sit in the temptation of it, because pretending it wasn't tempting would have been a lie, and he'd promised himself a long time ago he wouldn't lie to make himself look better than he was. Then he closed the folder and slid it back across the workbench toward her. "No." Odessa blinked, like she'd expected resistance, but not this quickly. "Desmond, I'm not doing this because I'm proud, or because I think taking your money makes me less of a man. I'm doing it because I've spent 2 days finding out I have 3 daughters I didn't know existed, and you're offering me a check to go back to not knowing them." He kept his voice even, though it cost him something to do it. "I don't want your money. I want to not be a stranger to them anymore." "It's not that simple," Odessa said. "They have a life, a rhythm. Introducing you changes all of it, and I don't know if that's fair to them or to you." "Maybe it's not simple," Desmond said, "but simple isn't the same as right. You said it yourself last night, standing outside their door, listening to them try to solve a mystery you could have explained years ago. They already know something's missing. The only question is whether they find out from you or they keep guessing in the dark." Odessa looked at him for a long time, something shifting behind her eyes. Not agreement exactly, but the first real crack in the composure she'd worn like armor since the moment he'd walked into her office. "You could have taken the money," she said quietly. "Most people would have." "I'm not most people," Desmond said. "I'm not looking for a payout. I'm not looking to blow up your life or theirs. I just don't want to keep being a stranger." The silence between them stretched out, filled only by the tick of the garage's old wall clock and the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. Desmond watched something in her expression soften, like she was seeing him, really seeing him, for the first time since she'd sat down on that stool. "What do you want then?" she asked finally, "if not money?" Desmond exhaled slowly, steadying himself for the request he'd been sitting on since the moment he'd walked out of her building 2 days earlier. "Let me meet them," he said, "not as a father demanding rights, not as a stranger asking permission. Just let me meet them once and let them decide from there what happens next." Moments like this remind us that some things in life are worth far more than money. If stories built on love, integrity, and second chances are why you're here, subscribe so you don't miss another unforgettable journey. Odessa didn't answer him right away. She sat on the stool a while longer, looking at the folder she'd brought with her, like it belonged to a version of the morning that no longer applied, and then she stood, smoothed her sweater down, and told him she needed time to think. Desmond gave her 3 days without a single call. He'd learned enough about her by now to know that pressure only made her retreat further behind whatever walls she'd spent years building, and if he wanted this to work, he needed her to arrive at the decision herself, not be pushed into it. She didn't call a lawyer. She thought about it, sat with her phone in her hand at midnight, scrolling through the contact list to the family attorney who'd handled everything from her father's estate to the Meridian Collective Incorporation papers, and put the phone down without dialing. This wasn't a matter for lawyers. Lawyers dealt in custody arrangements and liability, and what she was trying to figure out had nothing to do with either. It had to do with 3 daughters who'd been quietly building a case against her silence for years, and a man who'd turned down more money than most people saw in a decade because he wanted something a settlement couldn't buy. She thought about her own father, too, in ways she hadn't in a long time. A man who'd given her a company, a name, and expectations heavy enough to make her disappear under a different name for a weekend, just to breathe. He'd given her everything except the one thing she'd actually needed, which was permission to be uncertain out loud. She didn't want to hand her daughters that same inheritance. Meanwhile, the girls had noticed something shifting in the house, the way children always do, faster than adults give them credit for. Simone caught her mother staring at nothing over breakfast 3 mornings running. Naomi found an old photograph tucked in a drawer she wasn't supposed to be going through. Odessa, at 24, younger, unguarded, laughing at something outside the frame, wearing a jacket none of them recognized. Camille, the peacemaker, was the one who finally asked the question none of them had dared voice since the park. "Is he going to come see us?" Odessa set her coffee down slowly. "Who?" "The man from the bench," Camille said, patient the way she always was, like she already knew her mother was stalling. "The one with the mark." There wasn't a version of this conversation Odessa could survive by deflecting again. She looked at her 3 daughters, identical faces, 3 different sets of eyes waiting on her, and she made a decision faster than she'd made any decision in years. "Yes," she said, "if that's something you want." The girls exchanged a look between them. The private kind of communication triplets seemed to run on, some agreement passing silently between the 3 of them, before Simone spoke for all of them. "We want to know," she said, "even if it's complicated." That was the sentence that settled it. Odessa called Desmond that evening. "One afternoon," she told him. "Neutral place. Nothing promised beyond that." "That's all I asked for," Desmond said. They agreed on the botanical garden across town, public enough to feel safe, quiet enough not to feel like a spectacle. Odessa picked the date. Desmond didn't argue about the details, didn't push for more than what had been offered, and something about his restraint made her trust the arrangement a little more than she expected to. In the days leading up to it, Desmond spent every evening in the garage after Ezra went to bed, not fixing the Mustang, but working on something smaller. He'd found a block of walnut in the scrap pile behind the shop, good wood, the kind he usually saved for detail work on dashboards, and he sat with it under the workbench light, carving slowly, carefully, 3 small compasses meant to fit in a child's palm. Unlike the tattoo on his own arm, he gave each one a center, a needle, carved and set true, pointing the same direction every time no matter how you turned it. He didn't know if the girls would want anything from him. He didn't know if this afternoon would be the beginning of something or the entirety of it, but he wanted them to have something whole, even if everything else about this situation was fractured and uncertain. Ezra found him hunched over the workbench one night and asked what he was making. "Something for some friends," Desmond said, which wasn't a lie exactly, though it wasn't the whole truth either. He wasn't ready yet to explain to his 6-year-old that he had 3 daughters neither of them had known about a week ago. That conversation would come, not yet. The morning of, Desmond arrived at the botanical garden early, dressed carefully but not performatively. The same canvas jacket, clean shirt underneath, the 3 small compasses wrapped in cloth in his jacket pocket. He found a bench near the entrance and sat, the same way he'd sat at that park bench the day this all started, except now there was no coffee in his hand, nothing to occupy the nervous energy running through him. He checked his watch, checked it again 4 minutes later. The garden was quiet this early, mist still clinging to the hedges, the autumn trees along the main path holding on to the last of their color before the season turned fully toward winter. Somewhere beyond the entrance gate, a car pulled into the lot. Desmond stood without meaning to, heart moving faster than he wanted it to, eyes fixed on the path where 3 small figures and 1 taller one would eventually appear. He didn't know what today would become. He only knew he'd been waiting 8 years for a chance he hadn't known he needed, and now that it had finally arrived, all he could do was watch the entrance and wait to see if they'd come. They came through the gate a few minutes past 9, Odessa first, one hand resting lightly on Simone's shoulder, the other 2 girls flanking close behind, like they'd agreed beforehand not to let any distance open up between them. All 3 wore matching wool coats the color of the leaves scattered along the path, and all 3 stopped the moment they spotted Desmond standing near the bench, the same way they'd stopped in front of him at the playground a week earlier. Nobody moved for a second. Then Ezra, who Desmond had decided at the last minute to bring along, some instinct telling him this shouldn't be 4 strangers meeting for the first time in careful silence, broke away from his father's side and walked straight toward the girls like they were just new kids at the playground. "Are you triplets?" he asked, with the blunt curiosity only a 6-year-old could get away with. "That's so cool. Do you ever trick people?" Simone, caught off guard, let out a short laugh before she could stop herself. "Sometimes." "You should trick your mom," Ezra said seriously. "That would be so funny." "We tried that once," Camille admitted. "She figured it out because Naomi always laughs first." "I do not," Naomi said, already laughing. Whatever tension had been sitting over the gathering cracked slightly at the edges, just enough for Odessa's shoulders to drop half an inch, just enough for Desmond to feel like he could breathe normally again. He crouched down slightly, not too close, giving the girls room to close the distance themselves if they wanted to. "Hi," he said simply. "I'm Desmond." "We know," Simone said. "Mama told us." "Told us you didn't know about us," Naomi added, watching his face carefully, the same careful, testing look she'd had at the park. "Is that true?" "It's true," Desmond said. He didn't reach for anything softer to say, didn't try to make it prettier than it was. "I found out the same day you 3 walked up to me at the playground. I promise you, if I'd known, I would have come a long time ago." The girls exchanged their private look again, some silent vote passing between them, and Simone was the one who finally asked the question underneath all the others. "Why didn't you find us?" It landed exactly the way Desmond had known it would, the moment he'd let himself imagine this conversation in advance. He didn't flinch from it. "I didn't know you existed," he said. "I know that probably doesn't feel like enough of an answer, but it's the true one. If I'd known, nothing in the world would have kept me from being part of your lives." Camille studied him for a long moment, the peacemaker in her clearly weighing his words against whatever she'd expected to hear. Mama said the same thing, that it was her choice, not yours. "She was scared," Desmond said carefully, glancing briefly at Odessa, who stood a few feet back, arms wrapped around herself, watching the exchange with an expression somewhere between dread and hope. "Scared of a lot of things that had nothing to do with not wanting you to know me. That's between me and your mother to work through. It doesn't have anything to do with how much I want to know you now." Naomi, quiet since her question, took a small step closer, close enough that Desmond could see she had the same dark eyes he did, something in the shape of them unmistakably familiar, even though he'd never seen her face before a week ago. "Was it you crying?" she asked. "At the park, after we left." Desmond felt something tighten in his throat. He'd promised himself he wouldn't lie to them, not even to make himself look stronger than he'd been that day. "Yeah," he admitted, "it was." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Naomi, without any warning, closed the last few feet of distance and wrapped her arms around him. Desmond froze for half a second, unprepared for how small she felt, how easily his arms came up around her without him deciding to move them, some instinct older than the last 8 days taking over completely. Behind Naomi, he saw Odessa press a hand to her mouth, eyes filling before she could stop them, watching her daughter hug a man she'd spent 7 years keeping at a careful distance. Simone and Camille exchanged one more look, and then, as if some invisible agreement had been reached between the three of them, they moved forward too, until Desmond was crouched in the middle of the garden path, with 3 daughters he'd known for exactly 1 week pressed against him. Ezra, not wanting to be left out, wedged himself into the hug from the side, declaring loudly, "This is a good hug," which broke the last of the tension in the air, and pulled a genuine laugh out of everyone, even Odessa, even through the tears she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. They stayed like that longer than made sense for 4 children who'd known each other less than an hour, longer than made sense for anything except the fact that some things don't need years to feel true. When they finally separated, Simone wiped her face with her sleeve, embarrassed, and Camille immediately reached over to fix her sister's hair like the moment hadn't happened at all. "So, are you our dad now?" Naomi asked, direct as ever. Desmond glanced at Odessa, who gave the smallest nod, permission he hadn't realized he was waiting for. "I'd like to be," he said. "If that's something you all want too. No rush. We can figure it out together." Simone considered this with the same careful weighing she'd given everything else that morning, then extended a hand toward Ezra instead of answering directly. "You're our brother then," she said, like that settled something simpler and more immediate than the bigger question still hanging in the air. Ezra grinned and shook her hand like they were closing a business deal. "Cool. I always wanted sisters." Odessa laughed through her tears, and for the first time since the playground, something in her posture looked less like she was bracing for disaster and more like she was simply, finally, exhausted in a good way. After the hug, after the laughter, after Ezra had negotiated his new sisterhood with a handshake like he was closing a used car deal, the garden seemed to exhale, along with everyone standing in it. A groundskeeper passed by, pushing a cart of mulch, and gave the strange little gathering a curious glance before moving on, unaware he'd just walked past the most complicated reunion this particular path had probably ever seen. Desmond straightened up slowly, knees stiff from crouching so long, and reached into his jacket pocket. The cloth bundle inside had stayed wrapped the entire morning, waiting for a moment he hadn't been sure would actually arrive. "I made you 3 something," he said. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." He unwrapped the cloth carefully and held out his palm. 3 small wooden compasses sat there, each one carved from the same block of walnut, sanded smooth, oiled until the grain caught the morning light. Unlike the tattoo on his own arm, the ring, the 4 points, the hollow, unfinished center, each of these had a needle set true at the middle, fixed and complete, pointing the same direction no matter which way you turned it. Simone took hers first, turning it over in her small hands, running a finger along the smooth edge. "It's like your arm," she said, "but finished." "Yeah," Desmond said. "I figured mine's been unfinished long enough. Didn't seem right giving you 3 something broken." Camille held hers up to the light, watching the needle settle. "Does it always point the same way?" "North, every time," Desmond said. "Doesn't matter how you turn it, doesn't matter what's happening around it. It finds its direction and stays there." Naomi, holding hers close to her chest instead of examining it the way her sisters had, looked up at him with the same directness she'd carried all morning. "Is that supposed to mean something?" Desmond almost laughed, caught off guard by how quickly she saw through him. "Maybe a little." "I can't change yesterday," he said, looking between the 3 of them, then briefly at Odessa, who stood watching with both hands pressed against her mouth, like she was trying to hold something in that had already gotten away from her. I can't get back the birthdays, or the first days of school, or any of the 8 years I didn't know you existed. That's gone, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But maybe we can build what's ahead of us. Maybe that's worth something, even if it's not everything. Odessa wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, composure gone entirely now, standing in a public garden crying in front of her daughters in a way Desmond suspected she hadn't allowed herself to do in years. Simone noticed and reached for her mother's hand without being asked, holding it the way you'd steady someone who looked like they might need steadying. "You okay, Mama?" "I'm okay," Odessa said, and for once it sounded true instead of practiced. "I'm more than okay." Ezra, who had been quietly inspecting his own empty hands with a growing sense of injustice, tugged on Desmond's jacket. "Do I get one?" "You've had one since you were 3, Desmond said, ruffling his son's curls. "Remember the one on your dresser? I made that the same way." Ezra's face lit up like he'd just been let in on a secret that made him part of something bigger than himself, which, in a way, he suddenly was. "So we all match now." "Yeah, bud," Desmond said. "We all match now." The girls spent the next several minutes comparing their compasses to each other's, holding them up side by side to confirm they were identical, the way triplets seemed to instinctively check everything against each other before fully believing it was real. Naomi eventually slipped hers into the small leather satchel she'd carried since the park, patting the outside of the bag like she wanted to make sure it hadn't already disappeared. "Can we walk around?" Camille asked, glancing toward the wider paths of the garden, the ones that wound past beds of chrysanthemums, still holding on to color before the frost came for good. Odessa looked to Desmond, an unspoken question passing between them, some new, fragile negotiation of who got to answer for the children now, worked out silently in a glance. Desmond nodded, and Odessa nodded back. "Stay where we can see you," she said, and the 3 girls were off immediately, Ezra trailing behind them, peppering questions about whether triplets ever got their own rooms or had to share everything, whether they liked the same food, whether one of them was secretly in charge. That left Desmond and Odessa standing together at a slight distance, watching 4 children move down a garden path like they'd known each other their whole lives instead of 45 minutes. "Thank you," Odessa said quietly, not looking at him, eyes fixed on her daughters instead. "For not making today about proving a point, for not making it about proving anything at all." "Wasn't trying to prove anything," Desmond said. "Just wanted them to know I meant it, whatever that ends up looking like going forward." "It's not going to be simple," Odessa said. "Custody conversations. Schedules. My family, when they find out, and they will find out, is not going to make this easy. There's a whole world of complications waiting on the other side of this morning." "I know," Desmond said. "I'm not asking for simple. I gave up on simple the day 3 little girls pointed at my arm." Odessa almost smiled at that, the first real, unguarded smile he'd seen from her since the reunion began, and something about it reminded him briefly of the woman from the car show 8 years ago, before names and legacies and buried secrets had built themselves up between them. They watched in silence as the girls stopped ahead on the path, crouched together over something in the grass. A caterpillar, based on Ezra's excited shout, which sent all 3 girls into a chorus of half-delighted, half-horrified shrieking that echoed pleasantly across the quiet garden. "They're going to be okay," Odessa said, like she needed to hear herself say it out loud to believe it. "They're going to be more than okay," Desmond said. "Kids are better at this than we are. They don't carry the same weight we do. They just want to know where they stand, and now they know." Odessa nodded slowly, watching her daughters straighten up and continue down the path. 4 children, instead of 3 now, moving together like the addition had always belonged there. "What happens next?" she asked. "We figure it out," Desmond said, slowly, together, however that looks. Odessa didn't answer right away, but she didn't need to. The 2 of them stood there a while longer, side by side, watching the children weave between beds of late-blooming flowers under trees, just beginning to shed the last of their color, neither of them speaking, both of them, for the first time in a long while, simply present in a moment that didn't require an explanation. For the first time since the playground, since the search results, since the confession in a glass office 14 floors above the city, Desmond felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with anger or grief or fear. It felt, unmistakably, like direction. If this family's journey has touched your heart, subscribe and become part of a community that celebrates hope, family, and the kind of stories that stay with you long after they're over. 6 weeks passed, and none of it looked the way Desmond had imagined it might on that first morning in the botanical garden. There was no smooth transition into a new kind of family. There were calendars, actual physical calendars taped to the inside of his kitchen cabinet, and another one on Odessa's refrigerator, both covered in overlapping colors trying to track which weekend belonged to whom, which Tuesday had a piano lesson, which Thursday had a dentist appointment nobody had told him about until the morning of. There were awkward phone calls where he and Odessa negotiated logistics with the stiff formality of two people still learning how to talk to each other without 8 years of silence sitting between them. There was a lawyer eventually, not because either of them wanted a legal battle, but because Odessa's family, once they found out, which happened exactly as fast as she'd predicted, insisted on paperwork, insisted on protections, insisted on treating the whole arrangement like a merger instead of a family. Desmond didn't fight that part. He understood, in a way he wouldn't have a year ago, that some people only knew how to show love through structure, through contracts, through making sure nothing could be taken away without due process. He signed what needed signing and let the lawyers handle their part while he focused on the part that actually mattered to him. The girls came to his garage most Saturdays now, sitting on overturned crates near the workbench, watching him work on the Mustang he'd finally finished the week after the garden reunion, like some part of him had needed permission to close that chapter before he could open the next one. Naomi turned out to have an actual interest in the mechanics of it, asking questions sharp enough that Desmond found himself explaining torque and combustion the way he once had to grown men at car shows who took themselves far too seriously. Camille preferred sitting quietly nearby with a book, content just to be present without needing to participate. Simone mostly supervised, arms crossed, offering commentary on everyone's technique whether it was wanted or not. Ezra treated the whole arrangement like it was the greatest development of his 6 years on Earth. He introduced the girls to every neighbor, every checkout clerk, every stranger who made the mistake of asking about his family at the grocery store. "These are my sisters," he'd announce, full volume, like the sentence itself was a magic trick he never got tired of performing. Some days it made Desmond's throat tight in a way he didn't fully understand. Pride, maybe, or grief for the version of this that should have started years earlier, or something with no clean name at all. The hardest conversations happened between him and Odessa, late in the evening, after the kids had gone to bed at whichever house they were staying, both of them talking on the phone in low voices about things neither had expected to still be negotiating in their 30s, what the girls should call him, whether he should be at school functions, how much of his life he should explain to Ezra, and when. Odessa was careful in a way that sometimes read as guarded, and sometimes, Desmond was learning, was actually just caution, earned honestly, the kind you develop after making one enormous decision in secret, and living with the consequences alone for 7 years. "I keep waiting for this to feel like a mistake," she admitted to him one night, sitting on his back porch while the kids finished a movie inside, the first time she'd stayed past drop-off without an obvious reason to. "Not because of you, because I don't know how to trust something that came from something I hid for this long." "It doesn't have to feel resolved," Desmond told her. "It just has to feel honest. That's the only thing I'm asking for anymore." She didn't have a response to that right away, but she didn't leave either, and that told him more than words would have. There were harder days, too. A weekend where Simone, usually the most composed of the three, snapped at him over something small. A scheduling mix-up, a missed pickup time, and the argument revealed a current of resentment none of them had fully addressed yet. The quiet anger of a child who'd spent years without answers and wasn't required to forgive everyone just because the truth had finally arrived. Desmond didn't try to smooth it over too quickly. He let her be angry, sat with her through it, told her she was allowed to still be figuring out how she felt even while things moved forward. It wasn't a clean resolution. It was just honest, the way he'd promised himself things would be from here on out. By the second month, something had settled into a rhythm that wasn't perfect but was real. Wednesdays became Desmond's night with all 4 kids, dinner at his apartment, homework spread across the kitchen table, Ezra loudly narrating everything happening around him, while his sisters rolled their eyes with the particular fondness only siblings develop for each other's most exhausting habits. Weekends alternated. Holidays were still being negotiated, still occasionally tense, but negotiated together instead of decided unilaterally, the way everything had been for the first 7 years of the girls' lives. One Saturday in late November, they all ended up back at the botanical garden without planning it that way. Odessa suggested it, actually, a small gesture that Desmond understood as significant, even though she didn't say much about why. The same path, the same trees, further along now, most of their leaves finally down, the ground beneath them carpeted in gold and rust. The 4 children ran ahead the way they always did now, comfortable with each other, in a way that made the 6 weeks feel like they'd stretched into years. Naomi still carried her wooden compass everywhere, tucked in whatever bag she had that day. Camille had started carving her initials carefully into the underside of hers, a small private project she worked on slowly. With a pocket knife, Desmond had reluctantly agreed she was old enough to use under supervision. Simone kept hers on her nightstand, though she'd never admitted that to anyone. Desmond only knew because Ezra had mentioned it, unable to keep a secret if his life depended on it. He and Odessa walked a few paces behind, not needing to fill the silence with conversation the way they once had. She glanced sideways at him at one point, something almost like ease settling into her expression. "They're happy," she said. "Not a question." "They're figuring it out," Desmond said. "Same as us." Ahead of them, Ezra shouted something about a squirrel, and all 3 girls took off after him laughing. 4 kids chasing something small and quick beneath trees stripped down to their bare, honest shape. Desmond looked down at his own forearm, at the compass that had sat unfinished for 8 years, faded now but still visible beneath his rolled sleeve. He'd thought about finishing it, getting the center filled in the way he'd made sure the girls' compasses were complete. He hadn't done it yet, and lately he wasn't sure he needed to. It had never really been broken. It had just been waiting, all this time, to find the people it was supposed to point toward. Watching 4 children disappear around a bend in the path, laughing, unbothered, already building a version of family that hadn't existed 8 weeks ago and now seemed impossible to imagine any other way, Desmond understood something simple and complete. None of them were lost anymore. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.